In this episode, we are going to talk about the transformation of militant nationalism into the massive Swadeshi upsurge at the turn of the 19th century. You are all familiar with the story of how Curzon's Partition of Bengal acted as a major trigger for Swadeshism becoming a very powerful ingredient in the nationalist political ideology. But Swadeshi as an ideal, Swadeshi as a concept, had many different meanings. There were people who would otherwise be very moderate in their approach to political strategy, were also claiming that they were as much protagonists of Swadeshism as the militant opponents were. So before we talk about the emergence of Swadeshi as an alternative political ideology, it is important perhaps to look at the many dimensions of Swadeshi. Swadeshi, in the first place, as you know, implied a certain kind of self-strengthening movement, something which Tagore described as Atma-Shakti. Self-strengthening in the sense of strengthening the cultural basis of Indian society, the economic foundations of Indian society, through some kind of self-help measures, philanthropic societies which were also important, cooperatives which were expected to bring about a measure of prosperity among local communities. All these became important parts of the Swadeshi economic ideology. Later on, when the Swadeshi industrial enterprises began to be established, it became tied with the notion of the boycott, but boycott as a more assertive political ideology that suggested consumption of Indian products and rejection of Western products imported from outside.
How was the Swadeshi translated into a political ideology?
Yes, that is a very important question, but I have already hinted that some of Curzon's measures acted as a major trigger. But before we come to that, it is important to look at the manner in which some of the protagonists of Swadeshi began to draw on certain Hindu cultural symbols as a very important political resource. Using such cultural symbols as an important political resource, at one level was intended to build bridges with the larger society, who were not impressed by those liberal ideals to which the English-educated intelligentsia subscribed. So there was a feeling that if Hindu cultural symbols could be used as political resource, then it would be easier for the nationalists to reach out to the people. But the use of these symbols, to a large extent, was shaped by other kinds of concerns which had fit into the Swadeshi mentality or the Swadeshi attitude, Swadeshi approaches. You have, for example, the great protagonist of Swadeshi art, like Abanindranath Thakur, at the turn of the century, who actually, as you know, had drawn the sketch of Bharat Mata. Swadeshi Chitrakala. Abanindranath wrote a number of pieces on Swadeshi Chitrakala, asking his students to emulate the examples from Indian art tradition rather than emulating the examples of European artists. Apart from Swadeshi economic enterprises, you have a certain emphasis given by others on Swadeshi education. This Swadeshi education had also many features. For example, you have this Bengal Engineering College, which was set up early in the 20th century as an Swadeshi educational enterprise in order to train up people in modern technology, but at the same time, there were Swadeshi educational enterprises like Shantiniketan of Rabindranath Thakur set up in 1901, in which the ideal of ancient education sought to be incorporated within the educational system. The assumption was that Anglicized education did not give enough scope for the Indian genius to flourish. So it was necessary, therefore, that people like Tagore felt that it was important to hark back to some of the more creative traditions in Indian culture. You can see many dimensions of Swadeshi. For these different dimensions of Swadeshi to become telescoped into a political ideology, so that the militant nationalists could easily draw on these resources in order to strengthen their critique of imperialism, their critique of mendicancy practiced by the moderates, the political situation required certain happening.
Was Swadeshi movement a reaction against the failure of moderate politics?
To a large extent, yes. As I said already, that the moderate political language, the liberal political language, although it was secular, although it was visualizing a modern future for India, anticipating the emergence of modern representative institution, still they were using a political language which was unable to reach out to the uninformed. So people like Tilak and others who tried to create an alternative kind of mobilization, alternative focus of nationalist loyalty, they began to draw on cultural symbols from Indian history, from Indian tradition. This was perhaps the reason why he tried to popularize Ganapati festival. I was telling you in one of the last discussions that Ganapati festival was a private festival, was a family festival. To turn it into a public festival was intended to mobilize people. Shivaji festival, the great hero who was lionized by the organizers of such festivals, was intended once again to create nationalist heroes. In the same way some others would actually make Ranjit Singh another nationalist hero. This was also the time when many of the heroes of 1857 began to find their place in the works of history by Indians, inspired by this kind of Swadeshi ideology. So, by way of answering your question, that the political content in Swadeshi, however, came not merely from this use of Hindu cultural symbols alone. The political content came from the use of more modern political strategies like boycott or passive resistance. For that to happen, there was an imperial contribution as well. Curzon's regime was responsible for creating a certain kind of militancy, a certain kind of disillusionment, and disillusionment about British rule for its despotic pretensions, for the assertion of a certain kind of paternalist attitude, which was very common among the British civil servants of that time. This particular aspect became a source of great irritation for the nationalists, who began to reason that this mendicancy, this policy of petition, was not really going to influence government policy, was not going to make much of an impact on the government, which was committed to a certain paternalist ideal, which was committed to create barriers against the growth of modern representative institutions, which was not actually willing to allow Indians a space in the political system. So you have three major incidents, major legislations during Curzon's viceroyalty, which came as a reminder to militant nationalists that the time had come for them to start a crusade against the moderate political practice. One of these measures was the reform of the Calcutta Corporation. The Calcutta Corporation Bill 1899 actually reduced the elective component. And as you know that from the 1870s and 80s onwards, corporation, along with many other such local bodies, had become one of the major centers of nationalist activity. People who were interested in political matters were also interested in such institutions where they could actually exert some power, they could actually express their views about how to administer these bodies. So the decision to reduce the elective component, the decision to reinforce official power over this body came as a major irritation for the nationalists. The second was the University Bill. The same strategy was adopted by Curzon, which actually tried to increase the amount of government control over Calcutta University. And Calcutta University, like the Calcutta Municipal Corporation, was another institution around which much of nationalist activity at that stage revolved. Even this is true of a later time when the nationalists talked about the autonomy of the university. Thirdly, there was amendment of the Official Secrets Act, by which the native press was denied access to information on the ground that these were official secret. The Indian press interpreted it as a very strict measure of censorship that the Curzon regime was trying to impose on the Indian press. So all these measures suggested to the Indian nationalists, particularly the militant nationalists who were unhappy with moderate political practice, that the Curzon regime actually represented the basic character of British rule as a despotic regime, unwilling to extend to Indians the right of representation. The last major decision which acted as that trigger, as I said, the decision to partition Bengal in 1905.
Sir, what were the motives behind this partition of Bengal?
Now, you have really touched upon a major issue in historiography. Some of the apologists of Curzon policies try to explain the decision in terms of an administrative problem that the colonial state was facing from the late 19th century. Through accretion of new territories to the Bengal presidency, the size of the Bengal presidency had expanded tremendously. There was a stage when the reach of the Bengal presidency stretched up to the Satluj, up to Punjab. And you have on the eastern side the borders of Burma. Arakan, Assam and all these regions were part of the Bengal presidency. And the size became so daunting that sometime around the 1870s, the size was reduced by separating Assam as a province under a chief commissioner. Not a full-fledged province, but no longer really connected with the Bengal presidency. Then from 1870s onwards, down to the time when finally the decision was taken to partition Bengal, there were several attempts by the government, at times very secretly, which came up with different plans about how to reduce the size of the Bengal presidency to a manageable size. So there were plans to separate, say, Dhaka, Mymensingh, Rajshahi division and attach them to Assam. There are plans to reduce the size in the western frontier of the presidency. So all these plans actually suggested a certain administrative concern. Risley, the Home Secretary during Curzon regimes, came up with another proposal to separate the East Bengal districts and attach them with Assam. Finally, the decision was taken to separate the Eastern Bengal districts and attach them with Assam, which came as a major affront on nationalism, on Bengali regional pride. And this leads us to the other problem. Was it really administrative motivation? Or there was a political motivation as well? Curzon apparently felt that Calcutta was one of the main centers of nationalist activity. The Bengali Bhadralok providing leadership in the nationalist movement. So it was important for Curzon to reduce the strength of the Bengali nationalist by turning the Bengali Bhadralok a linguistic minority in the western part and the Bengali Hindu Bhadralok an ethnic religious minority in the eastern part. As you know, when finally the decision was taken to partition Bengal in 1905, the Eastern Bengal districts, Dhaka, Mymensingh, Rajshahi division, all these went to Assam and the province was created, Eastern Bengal and Assam. And you have the other part of Bengal presidency, Western Bengal, was linked with Bihar and Orissa. So if you look at Western Bengal, the Bengal presidency, the Bengali Bhadralok was a linguistic minority. If you look at the Eastern Bengal, they were a religious minority. So the political motive of weakening Bhadralok nationalism was certainly a very important concern for Curzon, and that was explicit in some of his speeches before the decision was ultimately taken to partition Bengal, he actually suggested that by way of creating a new province of Eastern Bengal and Assam, the government would be in a position to protect the interest of the Muslim majority in the Eastern Bengal districts, who are mostly rural people, mostly peasants, but the elite among the Muslims of Eastern Bengal would get greater access to opportunities. Dhaka will once again emerge as another important urban center. So the strategy to divide Bengal had this clear motive of weakening the growing strength of nationalism in Bengal, centered as it was around Calcutta. So that became the occasion for Swadeshi to become a very powerful political ideology, using boycott and passive resistance as two important innovations, as two new methods. And Swaraj was emerging in the imagination of many nationalists as the ultimate ideal. But one may also argue that on each of these three issues, like boycott, passive resistance and Swaraj, there would be differences of opinion. How much of passive resistance? How much of boycott? What kind of boycott? And what kind of Swaraj? We know for sure that about Swaraj people had different ideas. Some people thought that greater autonomy under British imperialism would be good enough for Indians. Some others felt that Swaraj would imply complete independence. Mere autonomy wouldn't suffice. To remain within the British Empire was an admission of weakness on the part of the nationalists. On boycott, there were similar differences of opinion. The more moderates among the nationalists would be inclined to use it as a kind of an economic boycott, asking people to boycott British goods, not British institutions as such. But boycott, if it is interpreted in a broader sense, led to an argument propped up by the militant nationalists that boycott would encompass, apart from British commodities, also British institutions. In other words, it implied that no one should go to the law court established by the British. There should be arbitration boards set up by the nationalists in the rural areas. In fact, some of the landlords also set up arbitration boards at this time, where disputes began to be settled. So rejection of British institutions, rejection of British commodities, all these would eventually become an important feature of Gandhian nationalism. So it is a methodological innovation in political strategy. New methods were being introduced by the Swadeshis to turn militant nationalism into a powerful political practice. The same can be said about passive resistance. Passive resistance was the ultimate political strategy that people like Aurobindo and others had recommended, arguing that the time had come for the Indians to defy the laws of the empire if these laws were not acceptable to them, to violate illegitimate laws of the empire.
How did the protagonists of the Swadeshi movement try to undertake political mobilization on a grander scale?
In other words, you were trying to raise the question of the kind of methods that the protagonists of Swadeshi movement had employed. Samiti movement was one of the major innovations during the Swadeshi age. Swadeshi Samitis were of different types. Some of the Samitis were philanthropic Samitis, inspired by the ideal of social service. And this ideal of social service to a large extent was shaped by Vivekananda's social service ideology. You have self-help societies, the Swadeshi Atmashakti, the ideal that Tagore and others propagated. Such societies were actually trying to set up industrial units on a small scale, popularizing local production, trying to sell local textiles, local matchsticks to the consumers. So some of these societies were basically trying to create a proper environment in which local enterprises could flourish. Some of these societies were physical culture societies. The history of physical culture movement can be traced to the 1890s, when the whole cult of manliness was propagated by the lay followers of Vivekananda, who actually called upon his followers to cultivate manliness by practicing asceticism. And this cult of manliness that this physical culture societies actually propagated was their answer to the British denigration, particularly of the Bengalis, as an effeminate people. So it became important for the nationalists to cultivate their masculine power through physical culture societies, and these physical culture societies in turn became one of the main centers of militant nationalist mobilization. The different kinds of Samitis were able to mobilize people on a much grander scale, but along with this, as Sumit Sarkar has rightly pointed out, that boycott and the enlarged interpretation of boycott that many of the militant nationalists had adopted, also another very important innovation. So he discussed the different trends in the Swadeshi movement. He says that some people were happy with constructive Swadeshi, which is basically a self-strengthening movement, strengthening the economic foundation or giving people access to economic resources through cooperatives. Tagore, for example, has this famous discussion in Swadeshi Samaj, in which he talks about the measures through which the Indian society could be strengthened by practicing Swadeshi, which basically you buy goods, local production, don't buy foreign products. Swadeshism here does not necessarily imply militant action, but there would be others trained in this physical culture movement or who will be inclined to adopt more militant postures, more militant strategies in order to force imperialism to quit India. So a time came when many of these members of such Samitis were indoctrinated by the cult of terrorism. The point is that when we look at the manner in which Professor Sumit Sarkar interprets Swadeshi and the manner through which he classifies Swadeshism into different strands, we see how Swadeshism applies also to moderates, where Swadeshism was limited to economic boycott, but then Swadeshism, when it actually acquires an enlarged meaning by the extension of the ideal of Swadeshi to a more militant, assertive political action like passive resistance, you see the beginning of the transformation. Now, as we conclude this discussion, we have to consider the long-term implications of all this. You have, on the one hand, the impact on the Congress. We will have the occasion to talk in detail about how Swadeshism would eventually make its impact on the Congress by creating a split in 1907. Already you had two different types of people wrestling with one another to achieve political power. You have seen it happening in Maharashtra. The militant nationalists led by Tilak, they were up in arms against the reformers in the Social Reform Association, in the Pune Sarvajanik Sabha. And this conflict, which has often been interpreted by some scholars as factional conflict, had very strong ideological content in it, something which I have already explained. At one level, liberalism, and it is ranged against a political ideology which was seeking to draw on Hindu cultural symbols, draw on lessons from our own history. Then you have the gradual collapse of the Samiti movement, its failure to implement economic boycott fully, because in the end, most of these, the local production centers which were producing local consumer goods, had to be sold for high prices. The cost of production was high and they were unable to compete with imported items. So a time came when the local people refused to consume local products and continued to opt for imported products for the simple reason that they were cheaper. So at this stage, because of the failure of the Samiti movement to create a broad-based movement based on peasant support, the dominance of the Samiti movement by the rent-receiving Bhadralok, ultimately the Samiti movement lost its way in what we call individual terror. Lastly, in the process of drawing on Hindu cultural symbols, the Swadeshi age also, despite the many great heights that Swadeshism achieved in the early 20th century, you can see it in music, you can see it in art, you can see it in intellectual pursuits, in history writing, in theatre. Despite all these great achievements, ultimately the use of such Hindu cultural symbols became responsible for a very serious discord in Indian body politics. Communalism, communal mobilization sowed these seeds of discord. We know already how the Arya movement itself became fractured. The moderate Aryas were eclipsed by the more militant Aryas. The militant Aryas began to adopt a more militant posture, linking up with the orthodox Sanatanists who propped up Hindi movement, who supported cow protectionism, which led to riots in the 1890s in many parts of India. So you have the long-term impact also in a certain strengthening of the communal forces in India in the early part of the 20th century as a consequence of the increasing use of such symbols, Hindu symbols, by the Swadeshists, by some of them at least. So you have to look at these three areas in order finally to assess the kind of impact that Swadeshi movement had made on Indian political life in the long term, and that we will discuss in a later occasion.